Welcome back, MTG Joe here. Today we're going to be trying out something different on the channel, so I do welcome feedback on this type of content. I am trying to branch out a bit. The gameplay content right now, the formats are a little stale. I'm not loving Lord of the Rings, but I still want to provide resources, so we'll continue with the meta updates. In the interim, we'll do the weekly meta breakdowns, everything like that, but we're going to cover today a sideboard guide. So what we're going to try to do is, with each of the top standard decks, provide a guide, my perspective, at least on how you would handle sideboarding for each of the current meta decks. So if you are interested in this type of content, do let me know. With all this, when we try out the new stuff, we kind of gauge it by views, general interest, stuff like that. Sometimes they're a hit, like the meta breakdowns that we've continued that series. Other times they've kind of fallen on their face, but 'tis content creation sometimes. So we are going to do today an Esper Legends deck. So Esper Legends currently is the highest win rate deck on Untapped GG from Diamond to Mythic, and is one of the most popular decks as well. So if we look at the meta itself in terms of popularity today, the Legends is the highest win rate deck. It is the fourth played deck, with Dimir midrange Esper Control being the most played. You have 5-color domain, mono red, enchantments, control, mono white humans, soldiers kind of get bucketed in that frame. So what we're going to do is we'll cover how we're approaching each of the decks. I'll give you my thoughts on how I'm kind of approaching it, what we're kind of thinking with that, and then I will make this sideboard guide available over Google Docs. So hopefully you should be able to access that and then see with that. So kind of to preface, I've played Esper Legends some amount. I'm not a go-to expert in it. I would probably say mono red's the deck I'm most comfortable with. So if there are like disagreements, I always welcome healthy conversation. So let me know in the comments if you disagree with anything. But I'll provide my rationale, and it may differ. And that's the nice thing with sideboarding. Sometimes it's not an exact science, as we'll kind of see as we go through it. So the deck that we are playing, to kind of start off, we'll kind of highlight it. So this is the version of the deck that's fairly heavy on creatures. There's versions that are a bit more mid-range focused with wedding announcements, stuff like that. But we are going to go off this deck list as it's the one with the highest win rate. So you have like the Ronas, this version's on the Raven Man to lose combo. So you kind of discard, draw cards through like the kind of stack it under to lose ability. The full shield Druid, 1 Urtai, 1 AO. 3 go for the throats as the only removal on the main board. This is the 27 land version with a bunch of the utility lands. Sideboard's fairly clean with cut downs, surges, 5 counter spells, Lorens, and temporary lockdown. So looking at the list, we're going to start off. So for the mirror, my thoughts are cut for Thalia's Guardians of Thraben, add in 4 cut downs. So generally in this matchup, if we look at like the mirror of the decks, there's not a huge amount of non-creature spells. Even post-board, if your opponent brings in removal, it still gets fairly, like the removal is usually fairly cheap, so it could be answered by Thalia fairly easy. So take that out. Also, the bodies are fairly big, so even the first strike doesn't really matter in this deck necessarily. So the thought was take it out, bring in the cut downs. The cut downs can hit pretty much all the 2 drops. The 1 drop could hit to lose. It could hit a Rafine before it gets going, as well as an Urtai. So it hits most of the creatures in the deck, plus they go for the throats as the backup. The one thing I would say is if they are on the version that has the wedding announcements, then I would bring in the Lorn. In terms of what I would cut, it'd probably be like a Gix and maybe like 1 copy of Skrelv would probably be it. Gix, like you're going to be flooding the board most likely. You're usually going to get in with 1 creature only. I'd probably just get rid of that. I do like in the mirror having the Raven Man, since your opponent's naturally going to be discarding through Connive, so it gives you the ability to get some more bodies. Against mono red, the thoughts were we're bringing in cut downs, we're bringing in temporary lockdowns, we're bringing in surge. We're kind of shifting our curve up, becoming a little bit more of a control deck. Against mono red, I do like keeping in the Thalias. They typically have a density of non-creature spells. All the burn spells, Kumano, stuff like that. So if you can kind of throw them off on the curve, they don't have a removal spell. The 2-power first strike can stonewall a lot of their creatures in combat as well, which is nice. The thought, like, Skrelv can protect against it, but you don't necessarily want to be taking 2 damage if you don't keep the mana up, and then itself can't block. So I'd rather kind of prioritize creatures that can block. In that regard, I'm also cutting the Raven Man, just kind of the weakest of our creatures. We're cutting a Toulouse, again, just like the weaker of our 3-drops, and I think Gix. The card draw we don't necessarily want in this. We're going to win this game with either like a very big Denic, Rafine, or like an AO kind of thing. So temporary lockdown also kind of deals with all their early aggression, so that's partially why we're cutting down some of the 2-drops, because they would get incidentally swept up by temporary lockdown, and obviously Surge of Salvation. As we're playing against a red deck, we can kind of protect our stuff that way there. Against Domain Ramp, we really just want to bring in the counter spells, really hit their big stuff, their sweepers, stuff of that nature. Sunfall is really rough for us. Archangel of Wrath can be pretty bad. Obviously, Atraxa, Atali, anything of that nature. And then the Lauren of the third paths hit Ossification or Leyline Binding. In this matchup, because all their removals exile-based, taking out the AOs, I'm taking out the Toulouse, because the Toulouse is a death trigger, not an exile, leave the battlefield trigger. So we're taking out that, taking out the Raven Mans, because it's like the weakest of the 2-drops. And my thoughts here are taking out 2 Sheoldred. Out of my other cards, I want to keep pressure on them. I do like the protection from Skrelv at times. Can also let us attack through an Atraxa if needed, through like protection from a color. But it's also, they don't really draw cards other than their draw step. They can offset the life loss with like Archangel of Wrath, Atraxa, both gain them life. Atraxa puts cards in their hand without naturally drawing. And it's kind of just like you cast 4 mana, they can get Leyline Binding. Doesn't feel great. So that's kind of my thoughts there with the kind of substitutions. In terms of the mono white Orzhov midrange deck, this one's probably got the most diversity in the manner in which it's set up. I usually don't want to have too much targeted removal for wedding announcement style decks. So like cut down's not the best. You usually want to just kind of go over the top with flyers, ideally. You still keep the go for the throats in case they have like Sarah Paragon, if they have like the 3-drop Saga that flips, stuff of that nature. So it's kind of going with that approach. So my thoughts were 4 Disdainful Stroke. Most of the mono white decks can either go into sweepers of some sort, whether it be Depopulate, Farewell, Sunfall. They have Wandering Emperor. They have the Eternal Emperor. So just cards in that ilk that we want to be able to counter. If they're heavy on like the more control version, then you can bring in the Negate. Similarly with Orzhov mid, you could kind of counter their bigger spells in that regard. Lauren deals with Ossification, deals with Wedding Announcement, anything of that kind of nature. For the Azorius Esper control, kind of just control in general, my thoughts are just bring in the counterspell package. If they are like blue-white and they're on Ossification, if they're on like incidental artifacts or enchantments, you could bring in the Lauren as well. Alternatively, if they're on like Esper and they're heavy targeted removal, you could bring in Surge of Salvation. My assumption here is most of the removal will be exile-based, based on how I'm kind of sideboarding. But pretty clean right now. Just get rid of your go for the throats. Get rid of AO if they're heavy on exile. If they're heavy on just targeted removal that doesn't exile, I'd keep AO in. And then I'd trim like a copy of Sheoldred, perhaps. And then a copy of Toulouse gets cut. Again, if they are heavy on just like cut down style removal, then Toulouse is fine. My concern with Toulouse is when they're playing a lot of exile based removal, or like Sunfall or stuff like that, then I'm less inclined to keep it in the deck. For green-white enchantments, there's like the aggressive versions, and then there's the Hallowed Haunting versions. I think largely you kind of board the same. If they are on the Hallowed Haunting version, I would probably bring in a Negate over one of the cutdowns. But really just because they're exile-based removal, get rid of AO, get rid of Toulouse, get rid of Raven Man, get rid of 1 Skrelv, and then 2 Ronas. You can also just keep all the Skrelvs in and get rid of the Ronas. Rona's kind of whatever to me in this matchup. You just want to be able to apply pressure on your opponent there. But kill their creatures, Lauren blows up stuff, and if they are kind of go wide, temporary lockdown helps clean that up, especially with like Wedding Announcement. So the Dimir mono black mid range. So for the most part, these are usually a little bit larger. If they are on the like lower to the ground version with like Fairy Mastermind, stuff of that nature, you may want to consider cut down. But my general thought here is get rid of the Raven Man, get rid of 1 Sheoldred and 3 Ronas. These are all cards that get hit by cut down. Thalia also gets hit by cut down, but at least it taxes. Denix, 2 cards in 1. Pretty much all the removals like targeted removals, so your stuff you can take advantage of like Toulouse and AO more in these particular matchups. The thoughts here are Disdainful Stroke for their bigger payoff spells, and then Surge of Salvation for protection. But depending on their configuration, you can go like 3-1 with Negate. You can bring in some cut downs as needed. It's really based on what you see. There's a big range in terms of how you kind of approach this. But the big kind of takeaway is if your opponent's got exile removal, get rid of the stuff that has dice trigger. If it has just like kill stuff without exile, then you could keep those in. But be mindful of like cut down being an efficient answer for some of your like larger threats. And then lastly, we have like the white aggro decks, the mono white humans, this various soldier decks. These decks are usually fairly heavy on creatures, so the thought is get rid of Thalia here. So unlike mono red that has a bunch of burn spells and incidental, these mono white decks usually either just play like a couple copies of Ossification or Lay Down Arms, and then they might have like Invasion of Gobukan in the side. But for the most part, they're not like too heavy on spells. So I'd rather just have threats, and then Raven Man's kind of like the weakest in this regard. You have cut downs and then temporary lockdowns, just kind of addressing, shifting up into a little bit more of a controlling, bigger mid-range role. So that's it for the deck. Let me know what you think of this kind of approach if you enjoy this, and we can potentially build it out into more decks, kind of have it going throughout the set, and kind of have a repository with like all the sideboard guides involved. But thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you have a great one, and catch you next time.